So we are in Ruth chapter 4. I know Pastor Pilgrim was here last week, shared with you Ruth chapter 3. I heard most of it while I was on vacation, and it was great having him here. I pray that you've been blessed by that. So Ruth chapter 4 tonight. We're going to break it up in two sections. I think the point that God is going to do through the book of Ruth, and like I've been sharing with you, is that when you step back from the book of Ruth and you look at the larger landscape of the book is set in just a really bad time for Israel. Not only have they constantly rebelled, they've been in political, economic, social trouble. And so there's just been a lot happening in this story. And these 4 chapters really, I believe, is God showing us his commitment to us, to his people, in the midst of just a lot of chaos. And like I said, when I looked at the book of Ruth and we're studying it, one of the things that kept coming to mind is perspective. Perspective of not only our situation, but really when you look at the book of Ruth and you kind of stand on top of it in the time frame of when it's being written, really about how God is moving despite all the chaotic waters that are around. And so this is the kind of the story here. And chapter 4 is climaxing after chapter 3. And Ruth comes to Boaz, makes a request. And so we're going to look at the first 12 verses here in chapter 4. Meanwhile, Boaz went up to the town gate and he sat down there just as the guardian redeemer he had mentioned came along. Boaz said, "Come over here, my friend, and sit down." So he went over and sat down. Boaz took 10 of the elders of the town and said, "Sit here," and they did so. Then he said to the guardian redeemer, "Naomi, who has come back from Moab, is selling the piece of land that belonged to our relative Elimelech. I thought I should bring the matter to your attention and suggest that you buy it in the presence of these seated here and in the presence of the elders of my people. If you will redeem it, do so. But if you will not, tell me so I will know. For no one has the right to do it except you, and I am next in line." "I will redeem it," he said. Then Boaz said, "On the day you buy the land from Naomi, you also acquire Ruth, the Moabite, the dead man's widow, in order to maintain the name of the dead man with his property." At this, the guardian redeemer said, "Then I can't redeem it, because I might endanger my own estate. You redeem it yourself. I can't do it." Now, in earlier times in Israel, for the redemption and transfer of property to become final, one party took off his sandal and gave it to the other. This was the method of legalizing transactions in Israel. So the guardian redeemer said to Boaz, "Buy it yourself." And he removed his sandal. Then Boaz announced to the elders and all the people, "Today you are witnesses that I have bought from Naomi all the property of Elimelech, Kilion, and Mahlon. I have also acquired Ruth the Moabite, Mahlon's widow, as my wife in order to maintain the name of the dead with his property, so that his name will not disappear from among the family or from his hometown. Today you are witnesses." Then the elders and all the people at the gate said, "We are witnesses. May the Lord make the woman who is coming into your home like Rachel and Leah, who together built up the family of Israel. May you have standing in Ephrath and be famous in Bethlehem. Through the offspring the Lord gives you by this young woman, may your family be like that of Perez, who Tamar bore to Judah." So when you first read this, and let's say you don't have the context of Ruth chapter 4, it just seems kind of like a weird fruit market where they're haggling over something. I mean, one's taking a sandal off, they're transferring it to each other, and there's just a lot going on in this scene. And one of the things that we're going to look at here is Ruth's request for provision. How did they get here? Boaz's commitment to Ruth and the family, and God's provision for Ruth. So Ruth's request for the provision, Boaz's commitment to Ruth, and God's provision in these details for Ruth. The first part is Ruth's request. Now, this is kind of odd for us as Westerners in the 21st century to be talking about buying or purchasing a piece of property that has attached to it a widow that you would have to have a child with to prolong that family's name. That's just not a normal thing that we would be accustomed to at all. And so some of the things is when you come to the Bible and you read about some of these customs and things like that, the first thing you're like, wow, this is really strange. But realize at the same time is what, it might be strange to us, but this is really how people, they lived at this time. Because they had this fundamental belief that the family unit, especially the lineage of people, like when you read most of the Bible and you get to those boring spots where it's just, then this person begot this person, begot this person, begot this person, begot this person. That's a really big deal. And why it is, it's showing how through this one family there is a progression of people. And so the thinking here, and God had instilled it, is that God had provided what they call a kinsman redeemer. This is someone who would take over this widow's right of marriage. He would marry the widow. She would have a child through him, and that child would be the part of the lineage of that family, and it would progress down. So this is kind of like a super big deal in this time and in this culture. It was such a big deal that there were different type of redeemers that existed. It was this idea that here's this Naomi who has no covering, or in a sense here, she has no husband, she has no heir, she has no one to give her land and possessions to. And so really, if you remember even the story of them coming into the land, God had separated all the land and said, okay, this family and this tribe, you get this, you get this, you get this, you get this, and all these parcel out. And so here's Naomi, no children, no husband. Where does the land go to? This is kind of a big problem. And so there's some debate is, can Naomi really sell the land? What's happening here? But the question arises, and really in chapter 3, we see Boaz's resolve of Ruth's request. So Boaz's resolve of Ruth's request. So the whole story, you have Ruth coming back as a foreigner. She's a widow into a land that's not her home. This is not what she grew up with. These are not her people. Honestly, she would be looked on as not only a foreigner, but in some senses, people that have oppressed her and her people. So she didn't have favor amongst a lot of the people that were there. But what Ruth did have is the ability over her character, what she would say in tough circumstances, what she would demonstrate through her work. And so what she did and what she had the ability to do was not to maybe influence people what they thought about Moabites, but what she had the ability to do was show what she really believed in, or what was really the most important thing to her. And so what she would do is she would demonstrate this ethic of provision for her mother-in-law. And what we've seen is Naomi was this character who was not only felt that God had left her, but God really had oppressed her. She had said, call me bitter. I want my name to be changed from pleasant, Naomi, to Marr, being bitter. Why is God doing this to me? This makes no sense. And so you have this really disenfranchised, really hurt individual Naomi, and then you have this foreigner, this woman Ruth, coming with her, and all she's doing is demonstrating this ethic of, hey, listen, I told you your God will be my God, your people will be my people. I'm going to show you that I really believe that. I'm going to work out what I really believe. And so she really, what we learned is took steps of faith. She went and saw all these people working. She knows she needed food. She took a step of faith. She went out by faith. She started harvesting grain. She started bringing it in and providing it. And through the story of all this, she runs into this character named Boaz. Boaz was not only a faithful man, but he was a good employer. And not only did he take care of his people, he actually took the initiative to provide for Ruth by making sure that not one of his people would harm her, but that she was given enough food and provision to survive. And so what you see here in chapters 1 and 2 is the story of provision of God for this woman named Ruth, who is demonstrating what she believes through what she's working, how she's living. And then you see this character of this man named Boaz, probably much older than Ruth, quite a bit older. And you see both of these characters, and you really see what they're about, what their life's about. Their life's about every day putting God first, putting others first, working hard. And you see this kind of character being built up in these two individuals. The irony of that is, in the story of the Judges, that's not the narrative you see. So there's these two individuals, they're working. The other irony that you see in this story is that Naomi, the person from here, the person that should be of faith, the person that is older, that should be modeling faith, who should be showing this to Ruth, is actually doing the opposite. She's bitter, she's angry, She's just saying, you know what? Go figure out what you need to figure out. And through what we saw here in the story is that through Ruth's resolve, through her steps of faith, her mother-in-law, who was a very bitter person, started to see clarity. She started to see more and more clearly what was before her. She started to see through Ruth's act of faith and the God's provision for her that, wait a minute, something else is going on that I don't see. So in chapter 3, verse 1, Naomi has this moment, and she goes, one day Ruth's mother-in-law, Naomi, said to her, my daughter, I must find a home for you where you will be well provided for. So she comes back, Ruth comes back with Naomi, they're there. The only future is basically working a harvest field, providing, hopefully to provide day by day. And then this moment of clarity, we don't know how much time had transpired, how long she was working in the field, but we do know that Naomi had a moment where she said, you know, this isn't good for you. She started to get some clarity back, and she says, what you need a home that somebody can provide for you. And so in this moment that they're having here, she tells her daughter-in-law, here's what I want you to do. In our custom, in our Jewish custom, there is a provision for you to have a home. There's actually a provision that a child could be born to you, which would carry on our name. And this would be well for you to do this. She says, okay, I'll do it. So what she tells her great idea is, get all dressed up. I want you to go, and I want you to sit at the feet of Boaz, because he is one of your kinsman redeemers. Verse 9 of chapter 3, she comes in the middle of the night and then startles him. Who are you, he asked. I'm your servant Ruth, she said. Spread the corner of your garment over me, since you are a guardian redeemer of our family. And so what she's doing at this moment, she's referencing actually some of Scripture and part of this role of this guardian redeemer. She says, Boaz, you actually have an obligation as a relative of ours to provide for us. And Boaz, as he's there, verse 10, he says, the Lord bless you, my daughter. He replied, the kindness is greater than that which you showed earlier. You have not run after younger men, whether rich or poor. And now, my daughter, don't be afraid. I will do for you as you ask. All the people of my town know that you are a woman of noble character. Although it is true, though I am a guardian redeemer of our family, there is another who is more closely related than I. And so the plot starts to thicken a little bit. So we see here is Boaz is going to fulfill his role, or wants to fulfill his role, to provide for Ruth, but he goes, hey, legally there's somebody else in between me and you for me to fulfill that. And so Ruth goes back, she tells her mother-in-law, verse 18 of chapter 3, then Naomi said, wait, my daughter, until you find out what happens, for the man will not rest until the matter is settled today. And so there's this tension building up, this idea of Ruth's request for provision through her mother-in-law, who says, you need to find a home. Ruth says, you're right. So she asked Boaz, and it was a bold request. And here's the deal. Faith by nature requires a lot of bold questions. It requires a lot of bold requests. You know, faith is not something that is a very timid thing. At times, faith is believing something about not only who God is, about what things are and how things work, that you take steps of faith, not to be annoying, not to be oppressive, but you take steps of faith in boldness. And here's what Ruth does again. She comes to him at night, knowing what it could look like, knowing that there's all these other things, knowing he could say no. But because of her faith, what she does is she takes a step of faith and she says, will you fulfill your role to our family? And he's like, I'll do it. But first there's this other guy we got to talk to. Here we go in chapter 4, when meanwhile Boaz went up to the town gate, sat down there just as a guardian redeemer he had mentioned came along. It's funny though, they don't mention this guy's name at all, which everybody gets a name, there's significance behind the name, but this guardian redeemer fella doesn't get a name. And there's a bunch of reasons why probably, but it's funny, they just call him, he came over to Mr. So-and-so, come over here, my friend, and sit down. So when they were sat down, then what Boaz does in verse 2, he took 10 of the elders of the town and said, sit here, and they did so. Now, this wasn't a show and tell thing. This was actually, he was holding a courtroom. So in this time, what you would do to make something legal in the town was designed where there would be a large gate that would protect the bad guys from coming in, and the elders of the city would go sit at the gate. So basically, he's getting the people responsible for the city officials. He's like, hey guys, I got this issue. I think I'd like to resolve it. So he grabs 10 elders to form kind of like a quorum, and they could speak legally for them. Then he takes this guardian redeemer, he sits him down, and he goes like, hey, listen, here's the deal. He said, Naomi, who has come back from Moab, is selling the piece of land that belonged to our relative, Elimelech. I thought I should bring the matter to your attention and suggest that you buy it in the presence of these seated here, in the presence of the elders of my people. If you will redeem it, do so. But if not, tell me, so I know, for no one has the right to do it except you, and I am next in line. And so it's kind of the guy, I don't know if he knows this is coming or not. He's walking in from the city doing his work. He comes in, and Boaz is like, I got a deal for you. Hey, there's a piece of property up for sale. Are you interested? He's like, a piece of property? That's a great idea. I could expand my land. I could put more crops on there. And he's like, yeah, I'll do it. That's a great deal. And then Boaz is like, oh, I forgot to mention one thing to you, though. There is this clause, right? He goes, on the day you buy it, though, verse 5, the land from Naomi, you also acquire Ruth the Moabite, the dead man's widow, in order to maintain the name of the dead with his property. And you have the 10 elders representing the court system of the time. You got Boaz, who's a pretty wealthy man. This guy who's just coming in from the field, or he's going out, and Boaz is waiting for him. He kind of sets him up a little bit, and he's like, you want to buy the property? Oh, that's a great deal. You know, I'll buy Park Place, just don't land on it. And so he's like, yeah, it's a great deal. Well, here's the catch, though. If you want to build any property on it, I got to sell you. You got to take Ruth. And you have all the 10 elders, all this pressure on this guy. The poor guy doesn't get named. That's probably why he would get embarrassed. And he's like, whoa, time out, hold the phone. No one said anything about this whole Redeemer thing. Now, here's kind of the rub. The rub is, though, this guy, being an Israelite, being someone that had a family, being all that, he should have done his job. His job as a redeemer should have fulfilled what God had called them as a people to do. But the responsibility of all that, what does he do? He gets bogged down by the scenario. He's like, well, I can't do this. In verse 6, I might endanger my own estate. So what he does is he first look not on his responsibility, not as not only a Jew in that time, not only as responsibility to fulfill, to provide for this family, he looks at himself. He goes, I can't marry her. I can't have a kid with her. You know what that's going to do to my inheritance? And what he does is he filters it through himself. This is going to mess me up. You know what? So I pass on the deal. You can do what you want to do. And most of the commentators, when they write about it, this is what they write about. It's kind of a sad spot. The reason they don't mention his name, they're like, yeah, this guy doesn't get a place in the story. This idea here of a kinsman redeemer, or this idea of redeeming, Deuteronomy 25, listen to what it says about this. He goes, if brothers are living together and one of them dies without a son, his widow must not marry outside the family. Her husband's brother shall take her and marry her and fulfill the duty of her brother-in-law to her. The first son she bears shall carry on the name of the dead brother, so that the name will not be blotted out from Israel. However, if a man does not want to marry his brother's wife, he shall go to the elders at the town gate and say, my husband's brother refuses to carry on his name in Israel. He will not fulfill the duty of the brother-in-law to me. Then the elder of his town shall summon him and talk to him. If he persists in saying, I don't want to marry her, his brother's widow shall go up to him in the presence of the elders, take off one of his sandals, spit in his face, and say, this is what is done to the man who will not build up his brother's family line. This man's line shall not be known in Israel as the family of the unsandaled. So this is kind of a big deal. So this redeeming aspect of it, they're like, you have a responsibility. There's a really saucy story in Genesis. It's not PG-13, so I'm not going to go into it right now because there's some kids. But there's a story that when you read it, especially the high school kids, when I taught through Genesis, is really super awkward. It's this whole idea of the husband dies, and so the next guy comes, and he's like, nah, I don't want to deal with all this. And he does something, and God just kills him on the spot. So why is it such a big deal to God Why is it such a big deal that this family continues on? Why is it such a big deal? Why is this provision built in here? And you see, part of what God was doing through the people of Israel was he was not only telling their story, but he's telling his story too. He's talking about how these are his people, his inheritance, his land. And so the responsibility when Ruth comes to Boaz at night, he goes, listen, I'm coming to you. I'm coming to you because this is your responsibility to do. And what is Boaz's response? He goes, as he says here, and he says it really emphatically, he tells her, he basically says, as God is true, verse here, but if he is not willing, as surely as the Lord lives, I will do it. And Boaz understood his responsibility, not only to what God had called him to do, but his responsibility to prolong this lineage. And so here's Ruth taking a bold step of faith by saying, he could tell me no. He could not do it. But what faith demands of me is not his response. What actually faith demands of me is for me to be faithful to what God's called me to do. There's so many times, like in this story, Ruth could have said, hey, I really don't feel comfortable saying this or that. Hey, what happens if he tells me no? Naomi, why do you have a bad attitude all the time? Why don't you get your stuff together and we can get this thing moving? But it doesn't happen. See, part of what faith does is faith brings a level of security to you so that when you walk out in faithfulness and you take steps of faith, you're not concerned about what other people say about you. Now, why is that? Because somebody has already said something about you. You see, really what's happening is when Ruth makes the statement, Naomi, your people will be my people, your God will be my God. I'm not worshiping the Moabite gods anymore. They're dead to me. Your God will be my God, and your people will be my people. What she said is at that moment, when she took a step of faith and she took it towards in this direction, Naomi's response didn't matter to her. The challenge of going to Boaz, this really kind of powerful man in the city, being a foreigner, being a widow, and she goes, you have a responsibility to redeem me. And I'm coming to you to call you out on it. Will you do it? Because the only way you can move in any of that type of boldness or faith is by having boldness and faith spoken to you. And how do we know that about Ruth? She says, God, you are my God. So when she comes into Judaism, where she comes into faith and comes into Israel, what does she have? Nothing. She's a foreigner who's a widow who has nothing to her name. Her mother-in-law doesn't have any property she legally really can sell. So what does Ruth really have? So for her faith, her conversion into this thing of God, you are my God, at that moment, when she believed him, that was the only thing that mattered to her. So she was able to deal with her mother-in-law who's a little bitter and having a hard time processing what just happened. She can go out and work in the field by faith and say, God, whatever happens, I know you're in control of whatever happens. She can go to Boaz at night and say, hey, listen, here's the deal. You should redeem our family. Isn't this what your law says for you to do? This idea of what faith does and how it pushes in, I just look at Boaz's response. I mean, Boaz, he goes after it. And this promise he makes to Ruth is that he says, hey, listen, it's going to be done, and I'm going to do it today. And what it does is, and what I notice about this is that faith, when you're living from a place of what God says about you, and you live out your faith, what that does is it has an impact on people. It's kind of like a battering ram. What it does is it breaks down the doors of other people who've said, you know what, faith is too hard for me. I can't do this. I'm really mad at God. And when somebody that has walking by faith because of who they believe God says about them, what they are, who they are in him, when it comes and it hits, and it hits, and it hits, really what's happening is Ruth isn't doing anything over the top. She's not sinning. She's just demonstrating what faith is meant to be. And what it does is for a person like Boaz, it makes him says, what do I got to do to get this done? And for a person like Naomi, it takes her bitter heart and starts to open her up to what God is doing. And here it's from this young woman who's a foreigner. And so what we see here is that Boaz has this tremendous amount of energy, this passion. Why is it? Because what Ruth's reputation out in the community is that of her character, of really what she believes, of really about her faith. Another interesting passage or part of this text that we see here is that this idea here of marriage. What essentially Boaz is going to do is he's going to marry Ruth in this scene. I'm not going to get into it for next week, but it says, verse 13, so Boaz took Ruth and she became his wife. This is the setting for the marriage. And just real quick, I want to talk about what's happening here. What you have here in this scene is that you have a public hearing, okay? This isn't a private thing. This is a public thing. You have 10 elders representing the authority of the city, but they're representing the authority of any type of land transfers, any legality of any type of sort. These men here, all 10 men, have to say, we're witnesses of this and we agree. So what you have right here is that you have him not only taking the property of Naomi, you have a marriage ceremony happening here. I remember talking to a couple that came into the church years ago, and they said, this whole marriage thing is like, I'm married to this person. I was like, oh, you guys got married and stuff like that? And they're like, well, no, we're married in our hearts. Oh, okay. So what does that mean? It's like, can you unmarry her in your heart? Like, does it work like that? And I think what you see here is that, and when I started talking to him, it was this confusion of like, well, why does the government have to give me permission to get married? God's the one, we want to get married, we're married, we just declare it. Well, that's you like declaring bankruptcy out loud. It doesn't work until you go through the judge and the court system. The idea is that marriage, and I love this, marriage is something that's not only permanent, it's exclusive, it's a commitment to each other. And what Ruth is really asking him, will you fulfill your commitment, but will you make it public? Will you do that? This thing about marriage, though, is marriage was something that when God created it was not just for Adam and Eve or not for the people of Israel. Marriage was an institution that God gave for all people. It was a way that God, in giving this institution to us, was a way for us to not only publicly, but make a permanent, exclusive commitment to the other person. For instance, in Genesis chapter 2, it says, this is why a man will leave his father and mother and is united to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. So in the beginning of Genesis, when the story of Adam and Eve, you have these two becoming one, and they leave their father and mother. So what you see here, that what God has designed as part of the framework for marriage is that this couple comes together and they become one flesh. Jesus comments about marriage in Matthew chapter 19. This is what he says. Haven't you read, he replied, that at the beginning the Creator made them male and female and said, for this reason a man shall leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So they are no longer two but one flesh. Therefore what God has joined together, let no one separate. But this idea, though, that Ruth and Boaz get married in the public square, this is what marriage, this idea that we even get married and we have a court document and it's stamped and we get signed. Getting married legally, right, is a way to show commitment. It's also, right here in this whole text, this is a public legal document. This is what's happening. They didn't have stone tablets. They traded each other's shoes, which is kind of weird. But this idea, though, here is happening is there's a legal commitment to the other person. And what I find is that what they write in here, that the idea that Boaz takes on the public in front of everybody, I am taking in Ruth, a foreigner, to be my wife. I'm going to marry her. We're going to be done. And it was done in public, and so that's such a way that the elders And all the people, verse 11, the gate said, "We are witnesses. May the Lord make this woman who is coming into your home like Rachel and Leah, who together built up the family of Israel. May you have a standing in Ephrath and be famous in Bethlehem." The witnesses, the elders, legally said, "We recognize this union." So marriage, by definition, has to be not only is it something permanent, not only it's something exclusive, one man and one wife, it's a commitment to each other. It's a commitment that's saying, to you, as I commit to you, and you commit to me, that these two, we become one. And in this commitment, it is something where in our culture, what we do is we exchange not shoes, but we exchange rings. It's a visual outward sign of a commitment that we've made. And so what I'm saying is, here in this thing, that story of Boaz and Ruth not only is something as a story that is a public story told in the city. I mean, here's the elders of the city. Here's Boaz challenging the other kinsman redeemer. "Will you redeem her?" He's like, "No, man, that's on you." He goes, "Then I'll do it, and she's my wife. I want everybody to know that." In the sense of this is an official legal ceremony. This is really, I think, fulfilling what this idea of marriage is all about. Is two people coming together as one. You know, I find it strange, in some cultures, there's things called arranged marriages, which I kind of like, especially I have kids, and so I'd like to maybe pick them out for them. But at the same time that kind of all changed about 150 years ago where, I guess we become more modern and you get to pick your own person, which is kind of a novel concept. But I do think that there is something to this, that marriage, whether arranged marriages or we in the West, we go on christianmingle.com. No, I'm just kidding. But you do whatever, we find that person, right? We get married, but the basis of that marriage is still something that's not only legal, it's recognized by not only the state that we live in, right? It's not only recognized by the people that were there, it's a ceremony. It's a moment where we make a public commitment to each other. It's something that's public. And so there's a beautiful thing that God has gifted to us as people. For instance, and this is what I thought is just fascinating years ago when I was thinking about it, marriage, like I said, is not something that's just for Christians. It's for all people. Work. God created work on the seventh day. He rested from his work. And God created Adam and Eve to work the garden. Is work only for Christians? No, it's for all people. And what you see as a part of these things is that God has given us institutions, marriage, work, and all these things to do what? For us to flourish as people. That they're not there to burden or to hinder, but it's the way that God created us to be. And so what I find is that in this beautiful story of Ruth and Boaz and Ruth in marriage together, publicly committing to each other, Boaz becoming the kinsman redeemer, redeeming Ruth. And there's actually the last part of this is a provision that is prayed over them. The provision that's prayed for them is this. The elders, when they get there, they say this: "We are witnesses. May the Lord make the woman who is coming into your home like Rachel and Leah, who together built up the family of Israel. May you have standing in Ephrath and be famous in Bethlehem." Now, Bethlehem's where they're from. That's their hometown. "Through the offspring the Lord gives you by this young woman, may your family be that like of Perez, who Tamar bore to Judah." So the thinking here is of what the elders are saying is this: may someone come from you that's more famous than the city that comes from you. May he be that person who established the city of Bethlehem. May he be that famous. So the Bible doesn't mince a lot of words, and so what it's telling you, it really wants you to clue in on. And the next week, we're going to look here at the promise that God actually made and how he's going to fulfill this promise that he made to Boaz and Ruth. One other interesting note, though, before we close out is this, is that in chapter 1, when I was studying it today, chapter 1, when I was looking at their history about Ruth and their marriage, her first marriage, Look at what it says in chapter 1, verse 4. They married Moabite women, one named Orpah and the other Ruth, after they had lived there about 10 years. So here's the interesting part. She's a young lady. They're both young. They got married. They're there, but here's the thing. She never had any kids. Now that's weird. It's weird in this culture because what you did, your family was the center of everything. So what you wanted to do was have kids and have them a lot and as many as you could. Also, the infant mortality rate was really, really high. So babies died quite frequently and often. So when you had kids, what you wanted to do is you wanted to have a large family. 10 years, not one kid. And then he just dies. So in chapter 1, the tension is, Ruth, you didn't have any kids. You didn't bear any kids. And then now, the story is, now they're married. What's going to happen? She didn't have any kids. She's much older. Will she have kids? Because remember, what's Naomi's whole beef in this whole thing? You have, God, taken everything from me. You've taken my family. You've taken my future. You've taken my inheritance from me. Without a male child or someone to succeed our line, someone to take our property, we don't have a future. And you know what? I'm a little mad at you because of that. So the story's going to end. Next week, we'll finish off the rest of the story. She had an opportunity to have kids for 10 years. Let's say she got married in 8 years. She had an opportunity, didn't have one. What is going to happen at the end of the story? How is God going to work through the details? Will God, through what these elders had prayed, will God do something more marvelous than the person of Judah that had this child, Perez? More marvelous than this? What will he do through all the details? What will he do through all the pain? And here's the bottom line, that Ruth's faithfulness, her faithfulness not only to God and to his promises, her faithfulness is because of who God says she is. Not because of Naomi did all the right things. Not because she had to live in poverty. See, what the last point is this. Her circumstances of what was before her, that didn't define her. In all honesty, Ruth had nothing going her way. The only thing she did have was her faith. Her faith that this God is my God and these people are my people. We're going to sing a closing song tonight and we're going to finish off. But my invitation to us is that we have an opportunity to show people our faith. And our faith is not in our circumstances. It's not in if you are blessed or not. You have people that have had everything taken away from them, but what they demonstrate is faithfulness. Why? Why would they do that? Because I believe Ruth saw something. She saw God, who he is and what he's like. And because of that, she's like, you know what? I'll go work in a field. It doesn't matter. That's not who I am. You can call me a foreigner. You can call me a widow. You can say this about me, but that's not who I am. This God is my God. These are my people. And God, you do what you seem fit. And so she did not allow the circumstances of life to define her as a person. And that caused her to have bold faith in moments where she could live out what she believed. She could live out towards others. She could be bold to Boaz. She can listen to the criticism and complaining of her mother-in-law. She was just given this provision to deal with all these things. And so realizing that faith in what God has done and what he continues to do through what he says about us, that he loves us, that he's with us, that he's not abandoned us, and that he loves each and every one of us. So we're going to sing this song and then we're going to close out the service.